Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us tonight for the Thursday night debate. Tonight's debate regarding Russia has an excellent lineup, and we really hope to get a lot of engagement from all of you upstairs and downstairs as well. If you are unfamiliar with the format, the way this will work is that each pair of speakers will speak in alternation. So we will be starting with side proposition with Oksana opening, and then we will have Radoslaw Sikorski opening for the opposition. After that initial pair of speakers, we will move to the floor round. This is your chance to really make a point, either in proposition, opposition, or abstention of the motion. If you want to make a point in abstention, that can be a question, a point of clarification, or just something that you would like to hear addressed in the rest of the debate. We will then return to the main debate, have the second pair of speakers, then it will be the floor round for the second time. Finally, we'll have the final pair of speakers who will make the closing remarks before we vote. There's also an opportunity for you to engage during the speeches by making a point of information. To do this, you can stand up, indicate, just say on that point or point of information, and it's entirely up to the speaker to take that point. So you can either, they'll indicate that they're taking your point, in which case wait for a microphone and then speak. Alternatively, they may keep speaking or decline your point, and it's entirely up to them. There will also be the opportunity to make that point in the floor round. Without further ado, we shall move to the first speaker in tonight's debate. The motion before the House is "This House regrets giving Russia the cold shoulder," and our first speaker is Oksana Boyka. Oksana is the host of the Worlds Apart bi-weekly geopolitical analysis show on Russia Today, which features a number of hard-hitting interviews with global political decision-makers. Oksana, the floor is yours.
Hello, guys. It's a great honor, great privilege, great pleasure to be speaking here before you. To be honest with you, one thing that surprised me when I was invited to take part in the debate was that we weren't actually asked what side we are going to argue in favor of. So I'm kind of squeezed into the corner, but I guess it's natural for Russian, let alone the Russian propagandists, to argue against giving Russia the cold shoulder. And I'm more or less attuned with that, with one caveat. I'm against giving anyone the cold shoulder as a matter of policy, as an attitude that comes before any substantive arguments. But on separate occasions, I think that's perfectly fine. And that occasion, I think, to illustrate that, I think would be the Western sanctions introduced against Russia. Some of my colleagues will speak about that at length, about the unintended consequences, mostly negative for the West. But I think there was one major positive consequence for Russia. And that is, I think the sanctions produced a major change in the Kremlin. Not the way President Obama intended them, but because he intended a change of personality in the Kremlin. But I think it also produced a change of thinking in the Kremlin, because Russia is a very peculiar country. It is always caught between planning big on the global stage and merely getting by at home. You know, we sent a first person into space before most of our people had running water. We built huge stadiums while we still have kids who have to walk like 5-6 kilometers through the forest to a nearby school. We fight terrorism in Syria, in Libya as well, but we still have lots and lots of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people dying from easily preventable diseases. We still treat contraception as a form of birth control. So Russia has always been caught between how it projects itself versus how it treats itself. And that is a very deep cultural, sociological, geographical question. And I think what President Obama, with his introduction of sanctions, did is to drive that message to the Kremlin, because it took away the cushion of easy Western financing that Russia has long relied upon to essentially get along with its hydrocarbon-reliant economy. And once that cushion was taken away, the Kremlin authorities were left with a choice, either of trying to substitute it, and there was a thought for some period of time that the Chinese could open up their open books and that would be fine. That failed to materialize. So the only possible option, the only natural option for the Russian authorities was to actually look at the Russian people and decide that the Russian people from now on will have to be the source of income for Russia to also sustain Russia's quite risky and ambitious geopolitical stance. Now, this combination between geopolitical and domestic has never been around, and we genuinely have to thank our Western colleagues, our Western friends, for driving that home. So I think that home for the Kremlin. Now, that is actually me arguing against the motion. I will provide you a counter-argument for the motion. I was just trying to say that sometimes on separate occasions, sanctions indeed, or giving somebody the cold shoulder can have good unintended consequences, good for us. Now, there are some negative consequences that I'm particularly concerned about, and I have a bit of a conflict of interest here because, I'm pretty aware of the fact that you perhaps view me as like this Kremlin or Russian bullhorn, which I perhaps am. I'm totally fine with that. I do my work honestly. I truly believe in the purpose. But on my spare time, I also sue the Russian state, particularly the Russian financial regulator, for not just myself. I mean, I'm part of a large group of people who are doing that. More and more people in Russia actually do that on a daily basis. And I think many of those people now find themselves quite concerned about the future of the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights, which is now in question because of the argument that Russia is embroiled in the Council of Europe, and that the opposite side would argue is only Russia's fault. But regardless of whose fault it is, there is now a real danger that the jurisdiction of that court will be suspended because the certain delegations in the Council of Europe believe that Russia has to be punished indefinitely for what it did in Ukraine, and we can discuss that later. I just want to finish my point, and I'm open to any questions. Russia believes that if it stays in the Council of Europe, it needs to participate. It could be criticized, but it needs to stay. Anyway, what I'm trying to tell you is that the Russian court system is a major, major trouble, just as the economy. And I think the Kremlin has realized that it has no way out but to reform its economy, and it actually has no alternative but to reform it, to try to generate that income that has been lost because of the fall in the oil prices. But what Russia also needs is to try to build a functioning, independent court system. And there have been some encouraging examples. China, for example, there have been a number of studies recently that show that Chinese efforts to build independent judiciary has actually paid off. And I think that's a more persuasive example for Russia than any of the Western liberal preaching, because the Western arguments are not taken in good faith in Russia. If the jurisdiction, and for many of the people who are trying to actually change the court system from within, the European Court of Human Rights is their last hope. Because the people who go to the European Court of Human Rights are the people who are suing the state. And in Russia, it's a highly arduous process, I can tell you. And it's not only because of corruption, it's not only because of high burden on the judges, but it's also about a very strong pro-government bias among the Russian judges. And the only court in the Russian jurisdiction that does not have that bias is the European Court of Human Rights. That's why Russians need to keep it on, even if that means some compromises on that side. Now, I think that is also one of the examples why the policy of giving the cold shoulder never works. It needs to be discriminate. I truly believe that moral and smart politics is very similar to good parenting. You need to know what you're dealing with. You need to know the strength, the weaknesses, the triggers, the dreams, the aspirations, the fears. And you need to appeal to the positives, to leverage the positives, and try to subdue the negatives. And that's why I ask you guys to vote in favor of the motion, because you can never achieve that by deciding to give somebody the cold shoulder. Thank you very much.
Oksana, for those opening remarks for the debate tonight. And now moving to our first speaker for the opposition. Radosław Sikorski is a Polish politician, journalist, and the Minister for Foreign Affairs between 2007 and 2014. Radosław, the floor is yours.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, Thank you very much for inviting me. I've come from Poland, probably for the last time without a visa. But before you deport me, I'd just like to say that I have a confession to make. President Putin also came to Gdańsk to mark the 70th anniversary of the breakout of the Second World War, which was important because it meant that he was abandoning the Stalinist version of history and agreeing with the European definition of when the war began. Trade blossomed. And yet today I'm having to argue on the opposite side of the motion. I'd like to thank the proposer, first of all, for defending the European Court of Human Rights. I think the British audience needs to hear this. That for many people, the European Court of Human Rights is a source of hope, and an example to follow. And indeed, it was a noble British-invented institution, which is now the butt of attacks and often confused with the European Union itself. But the motion that we've given Russia the cold shoulder cannot mean that we've somehow been snobbish towards Russia or irrationally hostile to Russia. In my view, we have bent over backwards since the end of the Cold War to try to integrate Russia with the Western world. A bit of history is necessary here. Russia went on a huge cul-de-sac in the 20th century. Bolshevism cost 20 million victims, 4 million. Of course, they wanted to invade the West. When I was defense minister, I declassified maps of the Warsaw Pact, which showed a desire to use nuclear weapons from the first day of conflict and use them all the way to the Atlantic. And I put to you, the real mistake we made in the early 1990s was not to insist that Russia rehabilitates itself by decommunization, by truly purging the totalitarian customs and values of that sick society.
On that point, sir.
I yield.
Was it not Chubai's stated aim that the goal of shock therapy was to destroy communism itself?
The goal of Chubai's plan was to privatize. And it was bold. It had some unwelcome side effects, namely that 100 people in Russia captured most of the wealth of that country. And that's why many Russians feel that democracy was the time of chaos and of the economic rape of that country. That's very unfortunate and psychologically understandable. Russia today is the most unequal developed society on earth. We should remember that. Russia today is a kleptocracy, with us as complicit partners, with the wealth being recycled through Western tax havens and through London properties. That was the model of Russian autocracy. But instead of insisting on Russia decommunizing, we embraced Russia. Quite right too. We spent billions sustaining Russia through the IMF. We invited Russia to the G7. We invited Russia to the WTO, Council of Europe, even though Russia didn't really fulfill the criteria because it wasn't a democracy. There was even an encouragement, and I had that dream too, of Russia joining NATO. Russia fulfilling the criteria of NATO, which are democracy, civilian control of the armed forces, settling territorial disputes with your neighbors, but Russia chose a different route. I think President Putin when he became prime minister, had a plan to modernize Russia, including strengthening civil society. And then he decided it was just too hard. It was easier to rule through that clique of oligarchs. And today we are where we are because Russia decided, instead of being on a convergence course with the West, President Putin has decided that since he cannot give rising living standards to his people, he wants to give them national glory. And he has defined national glory not in culture, which is wonderful in Russia, not in the economy, which could be very good in Russia, but in terms of territorial gains. And this is simply something that we cannot tolerate, Madam President. Russia waged a hybrid war on Ukraine. Russia has grabbed Ukrainian territory through the Anschluss of Crimea. Russia's forces are still in eastern Ukraine, have crossed across an internationally recognized border into the sovereign territory of another country. For the first time since the Second World War, a border in Europe has been changed by force on the pretext of protecting national minorities. Please.
Please wait for the microphone to make your point.
Sorry, but if I'm not mistaken, the borders of Yugoslavia were also changed by force, although it was internal force.
No, borders of Yugoslavia have not been changed, the internal borders.
NATO intervention?
There was a civil war, and NATO intervened to preempt genocide. That's quite different from taking your troops across an international border and occupying a neighbor's territory. It is not the same. And we have to express our condemnation of that. Russia lost the vote at the UN about Crimea and Ukraine by the most overwhelming majority in years. And Russia needs to understand that this cannot stand. We are talking about sanctions. These sanctions are very pointed. They are not directed at the Russian people. They are directed at the individuals who carried out the murder of Mr. Magnitsky and the individuals who carried out the Anschluss of Crimea. Those individuals cannot take advantage of the model, which is to rob the Russian people of their property and then enjoy the ill-gotten gains in the West. And I believe until Russia withdraws from Ukraine, until an honest referendum is held in Crimea, the sanctions should stay. Madam President, I rest my case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sikorski, and thank you to both speakers for opening the debate tonight. It is now time to go to a floor round, so this is the chance for you to make a point in proposition, opposition, or abstention. Firstly, are there any points in proposition of the motion that anyone would like to make downstairs or upstairs? We'll go just here. If you give her the microphone, please.
I just wanted to ask the previous speaker that I think that journalists agreed on that most people in Crimea wanted to join Russia. So even if the result of the referendum is perhaps exaggerated because the minorities were boycotting the referendum, but nevertheless, even anti-Russia journalists agree that clearly a majority of Crimeans wanted to join Russia, and usually you can make constitutional changes if you have over 2/3, and I don't think there are many people who deny that over 2/3 of Crimeans wanting to join Russia.
Thank you very much for your point. And is there a point in opposition of the motion? I think just there in the red jumper. If you could state your name and college for the record, please.
Ishan Bardwaj, Trinity College. I would like to direct my question to the Foreign Secretary. How could Poland conceive of lecturing Russia when right now its Foreign Secretary has asked for $1 trillion of reparations from Germany? It's undermining its free institutions and the media. Surely we should, make Poland more of an outcast than Russia in some respects.
You have a right to reply.
Madam President, I don't know where to begin. I agree with you that raking up the business of reparations right now is retrograde and is not going to work. But do you know that today's Poland is a country that has lost a third of its territory to the former Soviet Union, which was originally grabbed from Poland by the Nazi-Soviet pact, which carved up Central Europe and led directly, within 1 week, to the Second World War. Do you know that Poland lost 20% of its population, including the complete eradication of its capital city? I mean, sure, it's been a long time ago, and I think the political and legal case is not doable, but the moral case is certainly there. And those 20,000 Polish POWs, which were murdered in violation of every principle of war and of international law, on the orders of the Soviet Politburo, and we have the decision with the signatures of Stalin, Kalinin, and all those criminals. No compensation has been paid for that. So if you want to start to play the game of compensations, I assure you Poland would end up with a credit.
I don't want to be the album.
And are there any points in abstention of the motion? I think just on the back row there.
Giorgio, Hamilton College. Just like to make a comment with regards to sanctioning Russia because it has changed borders by force. We only have to look at Africa or the Middle East to see that the West has been playing Pictionary with global borders for a long, long time. So, as far as I'm concerned, there is a stench of hypocrisy with this entire motion. As far as we're aware, there aren't African citizens and Middle Eastern citizens standing here saying, should we give the West the cold shoulder?
Thank you very much for all those points there, and we will have another opportunity for a second floor round after the next pair of speakers. Speaking next on side proposition, we have Tim Riley. Tim is a Russian speaker who was educated at Cambridge and Durham and has worked at the Moscow Institute of International Relations. In 2016, he was appointed as a research fellow to the Centre of Rising Powers in the International Relations Department in Cambridge. Tim, the floor is now yours.
Madam President, members of the Union, ladies and gentlemen, I'm kind of beginning to regret taking this assignment on because it's going pretty much like I thought it would. This is a Marmite subject, and it'll be very difficult to persuade people otherwise. But I'm going to have a shot by trying to put Russia more in a sort of geopolitical setting and why it is necessary for us to try or retry or recontinue, whatever the term is, relations with Russia, either overtly or covertly, simply because of external factors affecting us all in terms of a new world order, what is the role of globalization, inequality around the world, wars that are happening in the Middle East, the rise of China, Belt Road Initiative and all these things. Where does Russia fit? And why is that important? And in terms of us, why should we have a relationship with Russia? So in many ways, the question to me seems almost irrelevant. It's gone. Yeah, we regret it. But what else could we do in terms of sanctions? That is a valid point of which the opposition would certainly agree and the ex-foreign minister would certainly endorse. But on the other hand, there was an element of what were we doing that we didn't know that something like this would happen, and we pushed and we pushed and we pushed. And we knew Russia's sensitivity, as Oksana has said, its internal view of itself, its view of geopolitics and worrying about external forces against it on three sides. Now the fourth side with the Arctic, with the ice melting, they're worried about being invaded from the north. So there was a mentality issue there that we should have perhaps been a little bit more relevant. But it's also outdated, and this is the key point, what I'm trying to say here, is look forward. What has been has been. Ukraine, possibly there may be a resolution. Putin has even suggested UN in there. Crimea, forget it, in my opinion. Forget it. This is going back to Peter the Great. Zhirinovsky in the 90s talking about Gazprom employees dabbling their boots in the Indian Ocean. This is about access to the south. Russia will not let that go. Forget it. So look forward. What is the world ahead of us? What I want to do is just say very quick, as you all know, and you'll be well aware of what is happening in the world. What is going on? Well, there is a new order being thought about. There is a change, and the speed of change in the world is fantastic. It's very hard to keep up. One of the things that Russia has recognized, to some extent China, is they've recognized better than the West the speed of this change. They are more adaptable and they're more flexible. Nowhere more so than in asymmetric warfare. They see an advantage, they move. They took two risks that we don't take in the West anymore. We chat and have a committee and send the UN or a force. They took on Crimea. They got into bed to some extent on an energy sentence, meaning with China, and they've gone into the Middle East. They take risks. We don't. This is the new world. We must be more flexible. Our institutions are not hacking it. We know it. Globalization, we talk about inequality from the proposal side. Inequality in the United States, something like 0.11% of the population of the United States has something like 85% of the wealth of the United States of America. Russia may be even more inequitous than that, but the value of its inequity is nothing that it is of America. So, strategy, alliances are altering, and Russia is keen on this. It sees the vacuum in the Middle East. It's moving fast. It sees potential alliance with China in the Asia-Pacific region. And Japan, South Korea, countries like this are very worried about it. It's moving fast. It's moving faster than we are. Leadership. If one thing about Putin is he says what he does and he does what he says, and he says, we're going here, and he's going. What that gets in the end is people who are unsure of their alliance saying, you know what, Obama talked a lot, but this guy moves. Leadership, folks. We are in a rule-based society, neoliberal, comfortable, stable, predictable in this room. You're all going to go into great jobs. You've got a Cambridge degree, 35K, holiday with your folks whilst you're students. Life is predictable for you. You don't take risks. This is not the world. We are at war. War is no longer an away game, folks. And Russia knows this. To some extent, China knows this. We have forgotten the rules. They are changing the way they think. In terms of strategy, they look at education, not training. Because if you educate a person, they can think the way out of a problem. Training, it goes wrong. As soon as you get over the start line in war, it goes wrong. What do? The training doesn't work. You have to think. Asymmetric warfare, example of people who have been trained to think under pressure when there's chaos, instability, and lack of predictability. Management, they have replaced that with leadership. They're doing that efficiently. We manage things because when it's stable, when the economy's fine, when we're making money, when things are predictable, when we have a law and legal-based system as we do in the West, we don't need leadership. We need management. We're administrators, all of us. Russia recognizes that the world's changed. You have to have leadership to make things happen now. Because management is about control. And in war and instability, control doesn't work. Obama can't control it. You've got to command it. They're doing that. These are warnings and why we need to stay with Russia. Listen to them, learn, okay? Efficiency. We're very efficient. Just-in-time management. Japan. In come your sandwiches from Sainsbury's. Monday morning at 11:30, 12 o'clock. They're sold. Incredibly efficient. But if there's chaos, lack of effective. When war starts, when things go wrong, what you need is effective people, not efficient people. You have to get things done. Syria, he goes in, I will not change Assad, I will take ISIS out. 2 years later, ISIS out, Assad there. Says what he does what he says. We went in, we're going to take ISIS out, and we're going to replace, and we're also going to take ISIS out, and we're going to replace Assad as well. That's a joint mission. Any military, yeah.
Please try and use the microphone just so everyone can hear as well. Thank you.
Just because you believe there are lessons we can learn from Russia in terms of dealing with the global world, does not mean that we should ignore and thus legitimize the illegal annexation of a country simply for the reason that it was effective enough for us not to be able to do anything at the time.
Couldn't agree more. But we, and people like yourselves, are paid to think why they did that. That's the lesson to learn. That's what I'm saying. How did they do that so fast? I talked to British Special Forces intelligence people, Americans. I said, could you do a trip like you did in Crimea, coordination of intelligence services, special forces, local mayors, propaganda, social media? And they said, right now we couldn't do it. Professionally, I can tell you both the United States and this country believe that operation from a military intelligence point of view was way beyond our capability. That's the lesson. Risk. We have no appetite for risk. Russia does. Now, let's move to sanctions. We're going to go to sanctions, look at those, see their effectiveness, and then I'm going to use one last thing, is that look at the Middle East and see how Russia is in action and why we need to stay close to it, if for no other reason than it's moving so fast and changing alliances so quickly that it is quite dangerous for us. It could be dangerous. Sanctions had good outcomes, as Oksana suggested, made them think about an industry other than hydrocarbon, ICT, relations with other countries, Japan, South Korea, to see if they can get technology side, moving into the Russian Far East, trying to develop that, getting Chinese money in there. They had these ideas. But there were 3 unintended consequences, ladies and gentlemen. 1, Sino-Russian relations in energy overnight got going. I work in the Arctic. That is now the Eurasian Arctic, not the North American Arctic, the European Arctic. So there was intense movement, and I would say strategically, we can talk about this in the debate, that this is moving ahead quite sharply. 2, increased militarization. We did not want that, but they have now got almost the incentive to do this, the militarization side of thing. But 3, it in no way inhibited the strategic movement, freedom of movement of Russia and the Kremlin. If anything, it's made them more determined. We did not want that to happen, but it's happened. Now, from the sanctions point of view, the point of the sanctions is they were there for very good reasons, as has been pointed out, which personally, privately, I would support. However, the sanctions now are no longer being imposed on Russia for Crimea. The latest sanctions are not even shared by the EU. They're aimed at Gazprom. 45 to 55% of revenues Gazprom gives to the Russian government. That is to bankrupt the country. That was not what we all signed up for in sanctions. The latest US plan is to bankrupt Gazprom, replace it with American LNG, off we go. So therefore the sanctions are stepping out. Where does it stop, folks? And what I'm saying is, from the proposition point of view, is we need to think about that. If it's not fit for purpose, have a review of sanctions. This is not what we intended. And in fact, the EU so strongly feels about it that doesn't agree with the US about it either. The hegemon idea. In 1987, Gorbachev made a speech in Murmansk and suggested, and he was talking about the Arctic, but then he said, there should be demilitarization of the Arctic, there should be environmental protection, there should be more collaboration between countries about the future of the planet and all the rest of it. Derided by the United States, it became the Environmental Forum, and now it is now called today the Arctic Council. A very, very successful multinational forum, including the United States and Russia, China an observer member, Canada, Norway, powerful countries like this. It did think of something. Here's the most important point. When Putin said the geopolitical loss of Soviet Union was the worst thing that's ever happened, all the rest of it, missing the point. What Gorbachev and Putin were really saying is, it's not we're anti-USA, we are anti-hegemon, which happens to be the United States of America. 2 different things. They want a multipolar world. This is what Russia is now quietly doing in the Middle East. This is why the example is good. So there is a multipolar world. China is part of that, a new world order. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is there behind it, and it's moving slowly in the Middle East. The Middle East, Saudi Arabia, is stuffed. Syria has horrified it. The Chinese have come in, and they've talked to the Russians about this and said, we are now the big player on the planet for oil, not America, not Europe. We are now going to convert petrodollars to petro-yuan. And Saudi, you carry that. You go explain that to Washington. You've lost Syria. Assad's in place. The Chinese are now telling them they're going to pay for oil in yuan. The Americans are not helping them in Qatar. They're not helping them in Yemen. Syria has gone up, and the Russians are now essentially brokering the Middle East for them. Who went to Moscow recently? The ruler of Saudi Arabia. Why?
Boris is going.
Sorry? Boris, yeah. Boris going. He, with the Saudi prince, why? Because he recognizes, back to my original point about leadership and vacuum, he recognized that Russia, if not the power, is the broker in the Middle East now. It's gone. Turkey has become the hub for gas. They've done a trade-off. Turkey went to Tehran, to Astana, and met the Iranians and the Russians quietly. What do you want? What do you want, Turkey? We want to sort the Kurds out, and we want to be the gas hub. China is behind that with the Belt and Road Initiative. There's already oil and gas deals being done. Rosneft is already in Iraq with the Kurds, helping the Turks on that, buying up oil companies in Iraq. This is the big picture, folks, that you have to see. Beyond the human rights, which are essential and civilized and right and sanctions, but you have to see why it is so vital that we stay close to Russia, either to thwart it, to help it, to shape it, but you must observe it. What this is about, then, for the Chinese following behind them, is they need stability in the Middle East. Putin went in. Quietly, you'll notice, one of the aims of China and Russia, cut out the terrorism in Iraq. Don't ask how they've done it, because we're into the human rights, and it won't be nice. But they've stopped it, bribed it, and killed people. Stopped it. China now has a platform into the Middle East. Iran is the hegemon politically. Saudi is discounted. Russia does the technical and the oil and gas. China brings the money with the Belt and Road Initiative. This is happening. This is well recorded. If you know where to look, if you're a sinologist or a criminologist like I was trained, you can spot this. You can see where it's going. It's logical, and it's extremely effective. So they will build out of this a multipolar world. My last point, if this is right, and you can watch this and follow this now yourselves, if they're building a multipolar world, rejecting America as the hegemon, or any other hegemon for that matter, then do we want to be part of that multipolar world or not? Because we better get on the train. And the train is coming from China. They've built a railway to Brussels. It's been to London twice. A little headline in the Times on about page 30. No one got the significance of that. To get to Britain, China has to come across the Eurasian landmass. That is Russia. And it's not going away. It'll always be a partner, a neighbor of Poland. America comes, America goes, plants a flag, and announces democracy. But Georgia's still there. Poland is still there. They still have to deal. The EU is still there. They still have to deal with getting their energy from Russia. And Russia knows this. So don't underestimate them. Be tough on sanctions, human rights, environmental aspects, the rest of it. But don't think that these people do not have a plan, because they do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Riley, for continuing for side proposition. And now we move to our second speaker on the opposition. Mr. Tom Brake is the Liberal Democrat MP for Castleton and Wallington and has been since 1997. He's currently serving as the Liberal Democrat Shadow First Secretary of State. Mr. Brake, the floor is now yours.
And perhaps more importantly than being the Shadow First Secretary of State, I am also the Liberal Democrat Brexit spokesman, and I have volunteered to come back and speak on a motion that Brexit is the single most disastrous decision the UK has taken in the last 50 years. So I'm looking forward perhaps to being invited. Now, we've just heard from Tim, I think, almost a call to arms for the United Kingdom. And in those circumstances, I think it would be strange to suddenly adopt a very warm and positive attitude towards the country, which I think he was calling on us to prepare for perhaps a future conflict with. What I would like to do, however, is focus a bit on what Oksana referred to during her opening remarks, and that was how Russia projects itself abroad, and I think Radek has very effectively dealt with that. But what I want to concentrate on how Russia projects itself at home. And of course, Oksana, I don't think, pointed out in her opening remarks that, of course, the difficulties that Russia has, for instance, from a health point of view, from an environmental point of view, well, of course, President Putin has been in charge for rather a long time and has failed in his time to address those issues. So I think they can be laying very much at his door. But what I wanted to focus on was on the issue of human rights, which Tim, in his last sentence, I think, said was something we should continue to focus on. So there's one organization that I have been a member of for longer than the Liberal Democrats, and that is Amnesty International. And during my time as a member of Amnesty International, which dates back to 1980, when I led the Amnesty International group at Imperial College, Russia, or the Soviet Union as it then was and now Russia, has always been a feature of the campaigning activities of Amnesty International. And I'm afraid, to this day, that remains the case. And is Russia a natural partner for us as a country in the way that I see France and Germany and Canada, for instance, as being natural partners? And I'm afraid that certainly from a human rights point of view, clearly it is anything but that natural partner. If you look at Russia's record in terms of LGBT rights, for instance, I'm very happy to give way to that very enthusiastic intervention from the back benches.
Please make sure to use the microphone.
Oh, okay. Thank you. First of all, I'm delighted you decided to grace our chamber with a tie. I felt that since this might be a step down from the House of Commons, you might come in topless. I find the focus on Russia rather perplexing, since homosexuality is illegal in, when I last checked, it was 48 countries around the world. It's punishable by death in 16 countries around the world, and 13 of those are a part of the Commonwealth, in which the Privy Council obviously still has some residual legal responsibilities. So will you or will you not admit that the focus on Russia is ideological, trying to bring it into line with the American hegemony?
Well, first of all, can I say, Madam President, that was a rather long intervention. Normally, I'm used to interventions that are much shorter and punchier in nature, but I would just say that there was a little bit of an in-joke there that people may not have picked up on, in that I am indeed the Member of Parliament who has secured from the Speaker the right that in the Chamber, the House of Commons, Members of Parliament should no longer have to wear a tie. So that is indeed the reference. But the issue about whether we are being perhaps ideological in terms of focusing on Russia, I will come to that shortly in relation to, for instance, Saudi Arabia. So in terms of human rights, issues around LGBT rights, issues around the rights of journalists to work freely in Russia. Now, if you look at Russia's record in terms of the number of journalists assassinated in Russia, I'm afraid it is a very poor record. I think in this year so far it has been 2, but if you track back and you look at previous years, I'm afraid the reason probably that there were only 2 killed in this year is because there was a very busy period of activity when many Russian journalists were killed when President Putin was in charge, which has probably meant that many journalists now, unless they are in the pay of the Russian government, as I think Oksana is, are very, very scared to speak openly because of the risk associated with that. So journalists at risk in Russia. Now, I haven't even referred yet to political opponents. Now, if you're a political opponent of Mr. Putin, you've got to be very courageous, because either you're going to end up dead, as Mr. Nemtsov was. If you're an opponent like Mr. Khodorkovsky, you might end up in a gulag, and if you're lucky, you will survive your term in a gulag and be able to then move into exile. Or if you're someone who manages to come to the United Kingdom, like Mr. Litvinenko, then I'm afraid you may end up poisoned and dead on our turf, and I'm afraid our government have not pursued that issue vigorously enough in my mind. So I'm afraid that there's not much in common that the UK has with Russia in terms of human rights issues. On the international perspective, Radek, I think, very successfully addressed that, but I just wanted to pick up on the intervention. So why are we adopting this attitude towards Russia? Well, I'd like to put on record the fact that certainly I, as a Member of Parliament, have been just as hard on Saudi Arabia. I'm very disappointed that our government is rolling out the red carpet for Saudi Arabia. I'm very worried that our Secretary of State for International Trade, Liam Fox, goes to somewhere like the Philippines and says to President Duterte, who is on record as saying he has personally shot people who he thought, I don't know whether he knew, but he alleged they were drug dealers, and he has recommended that approach to other people in the Philippines. Now, Mr. Fox has talked about the common values that he shares with Mr. Duterte. Well, I don't know. Personally, I don't feel as though I share many values with him, and therefore, yes, we can, rightly in my view, criticize Russia for its human rights record, but equally we should be just as aggressive in attacking other countries, and we should definitely not be rolling out the red carpet for them. And my worry is, I'll give way in a second, my worry is that, particularly to bring it to my favourite subject, Brexit, is that Brexit will indeed lead our government to traipse around the country, appealing to each and every unsavoury country, seeking dodgy trade deals with them because they are so desperate to prove that coming out of the European Union isn't going to do huge damage to us and to our economy. I'm very happy to give way.
Far be it from me to accuse the Liberal Democrats of being a little absolutist. On this particular issue, we're talking about nations and saying, oh, they have a terrible record on human rights. But saying that, does that change anything? When we declare ourselves out and attack these nations, we leave the meeting room. We're no longer in front of them, telling them, speaking to them. They don't see our society because we're not there. We've got to be in the meetings, we've got to engage, and then we'll bring about change.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and I think it was a valid point, but I think there is a difference between giving someone the cold shoulder and not engaging with them at all. So in relation to, for instance, President Trump, and whether he should have been given a state visit, so with all the pomp, getting to sit down with the Queen with her best china and having cucumber sandwiches, I definitely thought he should not be able to do that. I don't want us to treat him with respect which he doesn't treat others. But we need to deal with him. So, of course, he needs to come to the United Kingdom, he needs to engage, but without the pomp and ceremony associated with an official state visit. So I think there's one other aspect of Russia which I think means that we do need to treat them differently, and that is the very active intervention that Russia is making in our own affairs. Now, Oksana will know that Russia Today often email me and ask me to go on their TV channel. And I will never, ever do that as long as the line that she produces comes directly from the Kremlin. I'm afraid that, in a second, I'm afraid there are Labour politicians who will happily go on her show, but the only time I ever get a request to appear on her show is when I have said something critical about our own government. If I say something critical about President Putin, I am not going to get an email from Russia Today or Sputnik asking me to go on their show. I'm very happy to give way.
I think the gentleman is engaging in libel here, and he's definitely telling a lie, because when I personally asked to send a request, I specified that all the guests that we're inviting, we are interviewing them on air, live to tape, with no editing whatsoever. Moreover,
I didn't refer to editing in my comments.
Moreover, the program that I do is called Worlds Apart. We specifically look for people who disagree with our point of view, and every time when I start the interview, I actually ask them to be as critical as they can about the bloody Putin regime, because whenever they come on the show, for some reason, they tend to modulate that criticism a little bit. I think you can, pat yourself on the back for not appearing on this scary channel that I bet you've never actually watched. So you are actually talking about something that you have no idea of. You read it in the paper, and that's good. That's good for me. You're a politician, that's fair. Everything is fair in war, everything is fair in politics. But I think you're missing the crucial point. When you talk about Russia's intervention in your democracy or your political, there's a new term, Western informational sphere, that came out of the former head of the CIA. You're missing the point. We are not just about you. We are about the rest of the world, as my colleague said. We have viewership in Pakistan, in India, in China, in North Africa. And these people, actually, they are not with you, they are not with us. They are looking for a more fair, more engaged world. And believe it or not, they find us more balanced. We may be biased. We are absolutely clear about our bias that comes from our history.
You're the Pravda of
Okay. Okay. All right.
But it's good that... You know, the good thing about Pravda or truth is that there are many versions of it. You're entitled to your version, I'm entitled to mine. I'm not putting words in your mouth. We're trying to engage...
Madam President, this is not an intervention, this is a speech.
Are
you comfortable with that?
No. But unlike this is not a show for me. This is a show for you, but not for me. You attacked me personally. You told libelous things about me. And I'm telling you that you are telling a lie. You're a politician, that's fair, but you are telling a lie.
Hey. Well... I would point out, first of all, that you referred to editing, a phrase that I hadn't used in the debate today. You also referred to a libel. I'm not aware of having said anything that is libelous. I'm very careful as a politician to avoid saying things that are libelous, and I always go on the record when I say things. But I'd like to just quote so that people are aware of the sorts of things that Russia Today broadcast here were often investigated by Ofcom, because of things they say being simply untrue, I'm afraid to say. So, for instance, Russia Today publishing a poll saying that a third of Europeans considered Crimea a part of Russia. Well, I don't know who was in that poll, whether that was scientifically assessed, that apparently President Hollande regretted the sanctions against Russia. Well, I lived in France for 10 years, I can read French, I read his speech, and there was absolutely nothing in that speech that said he regretted sanctions against Russia, which your channel reported. Argued that the Dutch report concerning the downing of the flight over Ukraine was based on false facts and rigged by Ukraine. Well, I think most people would actually agree that it was, in fact, Russian-supported forces that were responsible for that. Whether there were inaccuracies, I don't know, but I think who was responsible for it is very clear. So I stand by the comments that I have made, and I will never go on Russia Today until you have an independent editorial policy that would give me the certainty that I was not participating in a propaganda exercise. I've only got 1 minute to conclude my remarks, so what I would like to say first of all, is that I think the human rights record that Russia has is appalling, and that has been consistent for many years. Yes, it is true that, of course, many other countries have appalling records as well on human rights, but I have actively campaigned on those countries as well, and that the difference between Russia and often many of those other countries with an appalling human rights record is that Russia is actively interfering in our affairs in a way that I see is damaging, and that we will no doubt find out in some greater detail in relation to their intervention in the last American presidential election. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Brake for his continuing remarks there for side opposition, and now we will return to the second floor round. It was excellent to see so much engagement amongst the speakers and to have points from the floor then, so I hope we can bring the same level of energy into the floor round now. If it looks like we've got a lot of points, I will go around twice, so don't worry if you don't get picked the first time. First of all, do we have any points in proposition of the motion upstairs at all, or was that a point upstairs or not? Okay. I will go for just here in the red top. If you could give her the microphone, please.
Thank you very much. Is this on? I think it was quite interesting that the opposition for this motion, pardon? Julia Churchill. I think it was quite interesting that the opposition, particularly the second speaker for the opposition, talked about Russia's human rights record, in particular its human rights record with regards to LGBT people. Now, if one of the purposes of our scheme of international diplomacy is to increase the access of Russian citizens to mechanisms by which they can enforce what we believe are their universal human rights, how is it wise then to remove even the possibility of their appeal to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Human Rights? I think it would have been interesting to hear some engagement from this side rather than ad hominem attacks about a particular news channel's truth.
Thank you very much for your point. And now for a point in opposition of the motion. I think we have one here.
Gabriel Barton Singer from Trinity. I apologise, I've lost my voice a little, but I felt a need to speak. I considered speaking in abstention, Madam President, because I felt a cold shoulder isn't chilly enough. British citizens have been murdered on British soil by agents of the Russian state. A sovereign state, which is our ally, has been invaded. The idea that a few measly sanctions are anywhere near far enough in our attitude to the behaviour of the Russian state is frankly ridiculous. I think we haven't gone anywhere near far enough. I think the threats issued recently towards Finland, who are rightly concerned about their autonomy, are vile and in abuse of how international relations should be conducted. And I think the idea that the civil war currently still raging in Ukraine, funded out of the Kremlin, should not be ignored. And whilst that continues, we should be much firmer and much harsher with Russia, who have a long way to go. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your point. Tim, did you have a point you wanted to make in response?
To that is, I certainly fully understand what you're saying. But as somebody that was arrested for so-called spying in Magadan and kept there for God knows how long, which was the center of the Gulag, by the way, the central administrative area of the Gulag, and then later was involved and got poisoned in the Litvinenko case, and also served in uniform on the Norwegian border and know the Finns very well. You would think that I would be on this side of the house. But what you learn from experiences like that, or you should learn from that, is why did it happen? How can you stop it doing it again? And the absolute imperative to keep on talking to your enemies as much as your friends. As I hinted at before, neoliberal organization, rule-obeying society that we have is very cliquey. We talk amongst ourselves. It takes nerve to go and take the Russians on about something like that. Your point about Finland, let me tell you, I was asked to speak a couple of years ago to the former Prime Minister of Finland, who was in London following sanctions. He was trying to sell the shoe industry to the city. Why? Because under sanctions, they had an atomic nuclear power station, peaceful purposes, being built by Russia. Sanctions, Americans out. They had a strategic railway trying to link up the Nordic countries up to the Arctic, exploitation of the Arctic there in terms of economy. Sanctioned, out. They had a $350 million deal with Sovcomflot for building icebreakers for the Russians. They're the best icebreaker, one of the best icebreaker people in the world. This tiny country like Finland, utterly destroyed. I still support the sanctions. Be very clear in terms of the moral reason. What else could we do, as you mentioned? You mentioned we could do more, but you have to think through consequences. Russia is no longer on its own. US leadership is diminishing. The center of economic gravity of the world in mid-Atlantic has gone to the Asia-Pacific region. These matter, these things. We must think before we move. We think tactically, not strategically. Russia thinks strategically and then moves tactically. We can lose out again. So Finland, yes, but right now Finland is with China and Russia, and they're being offered an optic fiber linking Finland along the Northern Sea route, down the Arctic, into China, Japan and South Korea.
I'll have to ask
That's
the
the
speaker
economy.
to bring his point to
So
a close.
be careful, you know, I've suffered from it. I've had a kicking from Russia in many ways, but I still think like this, and you have to ask the question, why do people like I think like that, that it's so important that we maintain dialogue. We don't shut the door, we open it, but we watch them coming through.
Madam President,
I have to ask
on the point
first
of
all
Finland,
that this stays in 30 seconds or less, just so that we can get in the rest of the speakers tonight. But Mr. Sikorsky.
last time I checked, Finland was a member of the European Union. And those sanctions are unanimously agreed by the European Union and have to be renewed every 6 months. And Finland votes for them.
Now for a point in abstention of the motion. Do we have anyone? Yes, just in the very back row there.
Hi, it's Ben Reimer from Christ. I was wondering if either house would care to define slightly more carefully what they actually mean by giving Russia the cold shoulder, because both houses seem to agree that there are elements of modern-day Russia that are morally questionable, and Tim Riley suggests that we should be trying to shape Russia's policies, and even says that he's in agreement that there should be some form of sanctions. So I was wondering if what actually distinguishes you from the opposition?
Again, 30 seconds or less, but right of reply.
The case, I think the honourable gentleman has rightly identified that in fact there may not be quite such a large gulf between us in terms of what cold shouldering means. So I think Radek in his opening remarks, I think focused rightly, and I think Tim would probably support this, on the importance of targeting sanctions at the individuals that you can identify as having been responsible for certain actions. So that is why I have pursued in Parliament with Bill Browder the question of Magnitsky, who was beaten to death in a Russian prison, and who we have been trying to ensure through UK government legislative action that we have got in place legislation that allows the assets of people who were believed to have been involved in his murder, which we believe, assets we believe they have managed to move to the United Kingdom, because I'm afraid for a lot of people, London in particular is a hotspot, a property hotspot where people like to bury their assets, that is the sort of measure that we should take, and it may be that at least some on the opposing benches might actually support that more targeted approach.
Okay, we're going to do 3 more points because there were a lot of hands from members, but there's going to be no right of reply so that we have time for both final speakers to speak in full. So is there another point in proposition of the motion? Sure, on the front row down there.
Thank you very much to the opposition for making such erudite and persuasive arguments. But what is confusing me here is that you're calling for sanctions, but you're also calling out Russia's domestic problems, which are most likely largely due to the fact that Russians are poor and education is underfunded. People can't survive easily. And the more sanctions you put on, the harder it is for people to survive, the more inflation, the more prices rise. And so, I just don't see how sanctions can be positive for Russia's domestic issues, which are serious.
I'm sorry, for reasons of time, we don't have a right of reply. Could we go to a point in opposition of the motion, please? Is there one upstairs? Yep, to take the point upstairs.
Hi, my point is that Russia has historically, time and again, showed that it is unwilling to compromise with its enemies. It must achieve complete domination over its enemies at the cost of everyone else. So how do you propose trying to perform a gradual rapprochement with Russia. When we see what happened in Ukraine, we try to be nice with them about Crimea. We try to play by their rules. But what happened? Crimea just ended up under Russian control. So just how are we supposed to do anything if we don't take a more firm stance against Russia to tell them that this isn't acceptable, to go back to the Cold War when we made a firm statement that we would not accept missiles in Cuba.
And finally, is there a point in abstention of the motion? I think we've got one on the front row there.
Jonas Claire. I'm just wondering how much we, or whoever we are, have actually given Russia the cold shoulder at all, and whether therefore the debate should be more like this House believes we regret, or this House regrets looking like we've given Russia the cold shoulder. We've placed troops in the Baltic states. We've backed sanctions in the EU. We also have back-channel discussions with intelligence agencies continually with Russia. All it is that's actually turning the cold shoulder is just the media making it look like it is.
And now we return to the debate, but hopefully the closing speakers can address some of the issues raised in those points and also the debate as a whole. To close for side proposition, we have Maria Long. Maria is the director of the International Outreach at Open Russia and co-founder of the Institute of Modern Russia. Maria, the floor is yours.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very grateful to you for inviting me, the voice of Russian opposition. Open Russia was founded by Mikhail Khodorkovsky. The one you mentioned spent 10 years in Russian Gulag, though he always says that Russian prisons are no longer Russian gulags anymore. They're much better than they used to be. But nevertheless, 10 years in a Russian prison, that's a long time. When I was invited to participate in this debate, I thought I'm on the wrong side. And my feeling would be that Russia is rightfully given the cold shoulder. But then I thought this is the opportunity for me to speak on behalf of actually Russia and Russian people, as opposed to President Vladimir Putin and the state machine that he can build. It's 100 people around President Putin, with maybe another 2,000-3,000 people that serve this 300 people. Russia is 140 million people. They're not the same. These 100 people, with 2,000 to 3,000 people around them, have usurped the power in Russia. They have no vote of Russian people. They're the ones who annex Crimea. They're the ones who project aggression on the rest of the world. They're the ones who go to Syria without representing any national interest of Russian people there. Russia has no reason to be in Syria. Why these people do that? Why do they engage in the foreign policy the way they engage? In this aggressive policy? The reason being is very simple. Putin has been in power for 18 years. It's longer than Brezhnev, less than Stalin. The only reason they do what they do is to stay in power, because there is no exit. Because if you leave the post, this institution, the throne of presidency, if you leave that, you're no one. You go to jail, and you're lucky to go to jail. You'll probably be killed. And people around Putin will also go to jail or be killed, and they know it. So the only way to stay in power is to explain to the population, to the society, that they should stand behind these 100 people with plus a few thousands of people, criminals who break rules, who break law, who break international order. So what you see in terms of foreign policy by the Russian Federation, and I refuse to say Russia Federation because it's not even the state to blame. It's this 100 people to blame. But what you see in a foreign policy is actually the preservation of power internally. Let's blame everything on the rest of the world. Americans are the worst enemy. Europe, the worst enemy. Because how else can we explain to the Russian people why we're living based on these living standards today? In the past 2 years, when sanctions were introduced, when the price of oil went down, the standard of living for every average Russian decreased by 20%. Putin cannot explain this by inefficiency of governance, by inefficiency of economy. He can only explain it by putting a finger at you. You here in the West. The only purpose the West serves today is to be that enemy that he can show the Russian people they're the ones to blame. If you understand this, and I hope you do, because when we talk about Russia, you mean Kremlin, you mean the leadership of Russia. And I want to argue with my colleague here about the leadership of Putin. You can't be a leader if you put people to prison. You can't be a leader and have the economy we have in Russia today. We have over 100 political prisoners today, almost the same as during the Soviet times. I mean, the known political prisoners at that time. So, Russia, and I urge you, please, not to equate Russia with Putin and Kremlin. Journalists make this mistake all the time. It's very easy to say, Russia did this. Russia is the aggressor. Russia is not behaving right. Russians are thieves. Russians are whatever. They are not capable of democracy. Let's just contain them. Let's isolate them. Let's put policies in place to close them up. We all remember that. I remember this too, because I was born and raised still partially in that part of the Soviet Union, in the city of Leningrad. So, Russian people, what do Russian people want? By data of Levada Center, 70% of Russians, and that's December of last year, want normalization of relationship with the West. They don't want to fight. They don't want for their sons, daughters, or whoever be killed in Syria. They don't want to kill their brothers and sisters in Ukraine.
Please wait for a microphone if the steward could pass on.
My name is Luke. I'm from King's. You keep arguing on behalf of the Russians and that they want normalization with the West. Yet, what use is all of this if we can't breach these 300 people that you constantly speak about, both geopolitically and internally? What use is it if we cannot get through to them or create policies over 18 years of Putin's regime and not help them? The thing that I'm an East German, the thing that freed my parents, where's those exact policies? Not cuddling up to them and not... when you can't reach the people, you have to talk to the people in power, and those are these 300, and the right policy is to show them the cold shoulder because it has worked before.
I absolutely agree with you. Show your cold shoulder to these people. What's interesting is that most of these people keep their money in the West. Most of the money, the recent estimation I've heard just 2 weeks ago, $800 billion to $1 trillion are outside of Russia and belong to a group of this maximum 5,000 people. They are here. You have them here. You just have to have the political will to reach them. But let me just finish. On the society, you can reach the Russian society too. Politicians. They prefer, because it's the language, common language of diplomacy, they prefer to deal with the leadership, as they call it, of Russia. Who do they roll the red carpet on in the European Union at every bilateral meeting? To the Russian leadership. They don't talk to the civil society directly because they say, this is not diplomatic. Civil society does speak to civil society. There's a lot of context, and there should be much more context like that. But I want to argue that when Western leaders meet with the Russia leadership, and I put it in quote, because in my opinion, these are not leaders, they're criminals that usurp the power in Russia, and I hope temporarily. So when they meet with them, they legitimize them. Then what does Russia Today show? Or Russian TV, Russian channels, the mainstream channels? They show that the Western leaders open or roll the red carpet for them, accept them as equal members of international society. That's pure legitimization of power of these criminals in the eyes of Russian citizens who watch this on Russian TV. Don't do that. You don't have to do it. Yes, follow the protocol. Yes, there has to be dialogue between the official Moscow and the official West. There has to be dialogue. There's things that cannot be discussed other than on that level. But don't legitimize them. Don't roll the red carpet.
Kanina.
These people may be criminals in your eyes, but what it sounds like you're suggesting is us seizing the money and assets of individuals without any criminal charges instead of taking political action. And from my understanding of world affairs, that's unacceptable. So how can you suggest that? How can that possibly be a way forward that would help anything?
Follow your own rules. There's plenty of anti-money laundering legislation and rules existing in the West. Every country is a little bit different, its own rules, but nevertheless they exist. You don't even need to have the Magnitsky Bill. Money laundering procedures are in place, and I'm telling you as a lawyer, they do exist. The question is there political will to enforce these rules? Let's take London. There's been kleptocracy tours in this country, in Oxford, in London, where there's a bus, and by the bus you go and they show you where Russian officials who live by Russian, not very big salary, buy these mansions. They hide behind offshore companies, third parties, etc. But it's a known fact that, at least in terms of some properties, they are owned by people who shouldn't own them. They own them because they stole property from Russian people. They're the ones who stole money in tax rebates, illegal tax rebates, and then killed Magnitsky, who whistleblowed for that. So follow your own rules. I'm not saying that you should not follow the rules. We want to, from Russia, we want to see how rule of law works. And we want to see that you prosecute people, you have evidence, you take them to court, you prosecute, you seize their assets if they shouldn't have those assets.
Madam, I wholeheartedly agree with you. But does the bench in favor of the motion agree with itself?
Yes.
And if I may, having the privilege of standing here, I want to make one probably last point. What is the best way to deal in this country with the anti-Western propaganda by Kremlin. Visas. At the moment, visas for Russians. Visas for Russians are considered a form of sanctions. And I know this because I've been researching it for a year. And with the colleagues of mine from the Chatham House, from the universities that have Russia programs, we're actually preparing a letter to petition the government here to ease and facilitate the visa process for young Russians, 18 to 25. They're not part of that criminal group. They're 18 to 25. What is the better way to open your society by inviting these young Russians, give them visa, almost free visa, or a very facilitated process to get those visas for 18 to 25, and let them come for maximum 5 days. Let them see this country and how democracy actually works, how rule of law works. 5 days. Make this visa accessible. At the moment, United Kingdom has the most expensive visas and the most bureaucratic visa process in the entire Europe. So I will conclude by saying, please, when you read the newspapers, when you watch the TV, please be careful. When you see the word Russia, is it really about Russia and Russian people? Or is it about Kremlin propaganda machine, official Moscow? There's plenty of terms to replace Russia with. And please urge your politicians, urge media here in this country to pay attention in this, because otherwise you will isolate us in Russia. And then when Putin goes, and he will go, believe me, he's not there forever. And that system, Putinism system, is not there forever. Because I see young people who go on the streets. Every day I talk to young Russians who want a better life, who want a better country for themselves. So when this regime goes, it will take much longer to again communicate with each other, establish those contacts. So let's not lose the time now. That regime has hopefully, less than 10 years. And there will be another opportunity for a better place. And then we do need Russia here in the West. That's the way to deal with the problems, the true problems in this world. So please don't make Russia and Russian people a threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Maria for closing the side proposition. And now to close for the opposition and the debate as a whole, we have Sarah Lane. Sarah is a research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, whose work focuses on post-Soviet foreign policy. Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And as a graduate of Clare College, I'm delighted to be back in Cambridge and able to speak here. It's been a fascinating debate so far. I just wanted to maybe go back to basics in some ways. I was very pleased that someone raised the point of what do we mean by cold shoulder in this situation. And I think the point of this is it hasn't been a complete freeze out. There is still very much been emphasis on the fact that we still want dialogue with Russia. In many different formats. The Minsk format was, a mixture of Western European leaders, Russia and Ukraine, coming together for dialogue. Obviously not very successful because it's a very difficult issue to address, but it's not a freeze out. And this goes to the point of the sanctions, which has been the main cold shoulder, I guess, basis for this discussion. They've been very targeted. They haven't been against the Russian people for the very reason that they don't want to alienate. Please, go ahead.
Please make sure to use a microphone for the recording.
I think you seem to misunderstand the general economic effects that targeting 18 state-owned companies have. And I think you misunderstand that it was very much the Western sanctions that had a role in having the Russian ruble fall by 50%. destroying people's savings, people's livelihoods. It very much has an effect.
I think actually, I would dispute the fact that it was the sanctions alone. You can't differentiate that from the drop in oil price, which had a very big effect on the ruble, but also state-owned enterprises are not, of course they have an economic knock-on effect, but that has also been exacerbated by the Russian government's lack of reform on the economy. So actually defining how much the sanctions specifically alone affected everyday life is very difficult. That's why they were targeting sectors and not generally the economy as a whole. I would say also that on the sanctions specifically, they have to be targeted because by EU law, it's actually very difficult to put people on a sanctions list. So, for example, the Rothenberg brothers have challenged these in the European courts. You can't just put, for example, Abramovich, who owns a football club and has property in London. You legally cannot just put him on a list because he will successfully challenge it. It was supposed to be about those who have benefited from or supported Ukraine, what Russia did in Ukraine. Therefore, again, this just goes back to the point that it's not a complete freeze-out. And then it goes to maybe the origins of why this cold shoulder has occurred. And I'd just like to, again, bring it back to Ukraine, which is the fundamental reason why, Russia has been excluded from certain organizations like the G8, but also has been sanctioned. There was the annexation of Crimea. Now, the point was raised earlier that, actually, overwhelmingly, people tended to support being part of Russia anyway. That's fine. But it went against Ukraine's constitution to do what Russia did. It was also not a free and fair referendum. So if you're that sure about the overwhelming support, why not have a proper referendum and have international observers attend? Please.
If you could wait for a microphone, please.
Yeah, so in Crimea, Ukraine had just passed legislation which would be the first step towards banning the Russian language in Crimea. Now, Crimea.
And he never signed it never signed that into law. So yes, of course, it was a terrible political move, and it was. This is not me justifying what Kiev has done, because obviously there was a difficulty in the way that the power transition happened in Kiev. Yanukovych had fled. There was the February agreement that people thought would work. It didn't. It all fell apart. There was chaos. But I'm talking about a foreign country going in and annexing part of another country illegally. And that's why we have sanctions.
May I?
Please.
Yeah, so the neo-Nazi people who wielded swastikas on their sleeves, who captured power in the Maidan, were clearly very much anti-Crimea. You saw the...
Yeah.
I just looked on Google Images, actually. You can type it in.
To say that everyone on Maidan
Facts
was a
don't care about
Nazi
your feelings,
is exactly
really.
you've supported my next point, which there was also an information campaign accompanying what was going on in Crimea. So to say trainloads of Nazis were coming to get you, Russia can protect you, also maybe makes people think about what's going on a little bit more. So all I'm saying is it was a very complex situation. I'm not saying what happened in Kiev was all legitimate and legal in the way that the West would have liked it to be. But the point is, we're talking about the cold shoulder, and it was about annexing another part of a country illegally. And that's different, certainly different to what happened in Kiev. The second point I would make is the Donbass. So after the annexation of Crimea, obviously you had the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Now, Russia always refers to this as a civil war. It's not, because if you send special forces over the border, give people arms, it's not really technically a complete civil war. The head of this campaign was former GRU. I don't think that's necessarily clear-cut in that it was all a Ukrainian issue. There was clearly a campaign to foment instability in eastern Ukraine as part of Russia's strategy to basically ensure that Ukraine as a country as a whole could never be pro-West. Sure.
Continued interruption, but was it not was it not the USA and Germany which went against the informal neutrality of Ukraine to put a pro-Western power into Ukraine,
they didn't
supporting
install a
them?
pro-Western
And was it not
power.
a response by Russia, therefore?
How did the West install? Of course, there was the leaked tape of Victoria Nuland, very unfortunate. But my point is they didn't create the Maidan. The West did not create Maidan. They funded maybe civil society. They didn't. It wasn't a color revolution.
In the same way that the West didn't create the '67 Iranian Revolution.
I mean, what happened? I'm talking about Ukraine. So I don't think that's relevant to this point. Again, going back to the Donbass.
While you're talking about Ukraine, keep in mind the Libya, the Syria, the Iran, the Iraq, the Afghanistan, and, well, other less apparent interventions.
Yeah.
The point is being, whatever you say about Russia's proxy politics, may be true to a certain extent, but don't you think that Russia took the script from the Western playbook? Isn't that the elephant in the room?
I don't, and I think this point was made about hypocrisy. And it's a fact, all governments are hypocritical, and of course there is, Iraq and Syria. The issue is that then that means anything goes, basically, in a world order. No, but that's the point that... Well, no, it doesn't, because the point is that there has been, Afghanistan, there's been Iraq, there's been Syria, there's been Libya, there's Yugoslavia. A Russian I spoke to said, we didn't learn from you, we're just going back and forth in terms of who's surprising who in the next intervention. There's been Georgia, there's been other places. Again, I think we're getting a little off topic.
I think that at this point, it will be time for taking no more interventions. Thank you, Sarah.
My point is, we are talking about why the West is correct in giving the cold shoulder to Russia, or why they do not regret giving the cold shoulder to Russia, because of these events that took place. And I would say, also in the Donbass, there's the governance issues of the horrendous human rights violations that have taken place at the hands of the leadership there, which is, very pro-separatist, pro-Russian. So that is in itself, I think, a reason why something needed to be done. And something that hasn't really been discussed, it was mentioned fleetingly, is MH17. I mean, that was a plane of innocent civilians, accidentally, I will say, shot down by Russian-provided weaponry, a Buk missile system that was not in the Donbass. There is footage of it crossing the border. It was not intentional necessarily, but that's another reason that maybe there needed to be a response of a cold shoulder. This was about taking a stand about the European security architecture being shifted. And that is more important, often, quite frankly, it's a fact to Western capitals than maybe what's happening in the Middle East. That's a hard fact. Another issue I would say about sanctions is, and this again goes to the cold shoulder issue, is it was actually in some ways a crisis management mechanism. It wasn't a punishment as such, in the sense of let's punish the whole Russian collective for what Putin has decided to do. It was deterrence. It was trying to deter Russia from going further, from killing more people, well, helping assist a conflict that was killing more people. And it was about buying time for Ukraine to try and get its house in order. Whatever anyone thinks of the geopolitics, which were very apparent over Ukraine, this was a geopolitical issue. It's not that the West was right to support Ukraine and Russia's wrong. It's just there was this conflict, and it was about buying time for Ukraine. It was also about creating political leverage that simply didn't exist for the West. So that, again, it was tactical in that sense. It was trying to raise the price and the risk calculation for Russia in its aggressive actions in Ukraine. And I think actually one thing that does support this idea of a cold shoulder is it kind of worked in some ways. Russia did not reverse the results of Maidan. It got the Donbass in chaos, or assisted in getting the Donbass in chaos. It annexed Crimea, but it didn't retake and install a pro-Russian government in Kiev. And I think this is important for the Russian calculation in Ukraine. And I would say to the point about Putin being in control, as I think was made earlier, Putin is certainly decisive. He is not in control of events in Ukraine. He would like to be, but he's not. It has not gone back to, as I say, a pro-Russian government. Therefore, the cold shoulder has had a function in trying to crisis manage the situation and stabilize it for good or bad geopolitical reasons. And then maybe some of my last points I would make is that the reason that I would say the West should not regret giving Russia the cold shoulder is the tactics that we see coming from Russia. One of them, the little green men in Crimea. Absolute denial that any of that was anything to do with Russia. And then, lo and behold, Putin actually admits it later, that there were little green men. That undermines any confidence and trust that, of course, Russia would say, you undermined all the trust first by going into Iraq and other places, fine, but this is Europe, it's a little bit different for Western political policymakers, and that meant that how do you come to a compromise? Therefore, the only option is a more sort of punitive measure of sanctions. And we see this a lot with the Zapad exercises that recently took place. Russia said that it would stay under the threshold for the Vienna document, and yet it did a lot of other things all at the same time. So you start really questioning whether there is any confidence-building measure in Europe that's keeping the European security architecture together. Trolling, we've seen, information campaigns, funding of Le Pen, which leaked documents linked back to the Russian government. There's tactics being used there that are not conducive to compromise or dialogue. Therefore, that's why the cold shoulder element comes in, as well as the attempt still at dialogue. And I will just make this final point. Often people talk about, we're in a new Cold War. I don't like that terminology because I think it's not useful for now, although we can draw useful lessons from the past, of course. This is ideological in a sense, but not in the same way. But I would say with Ukraine, which is why the cold shoulder has come in, it was a zero-sum game. It's a fact. Russia wanted a veto on that country's future. Europe did not want to allow Russia to have a veto on that country's future. So therefore, we should, of course, engage with Russia in other areas. We can perfectly compartmentalize over Syria. So this cold shoulder is very specific to a specific thing. And I think that's why we can't regret it.
I'm afraid there's no more time for points.
And I will finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah, for those closing remarks, and thank you to all of our speakers tonight and to everyone that made a point. Thank you especially to speakers for taking so many points. 2 quick notices before we move to the vote. Firstly, tomorrow we have another single speaker event with Baroness Hale, the President of the Supreme Court. She will be speaking here at 7 o'clock. And then this Saturday we have the Refugee Crisis Panel at 8 o'clock. Now for the vote. As ever at the Union, we vote with our feet. The motion before the House tonight is this House regrets giving Russia the cold shoulder. If you would like to vote with the proposition, please exit out of the right-hand door. If you would like to vote with the opposition, please exit out of the left-hand door with the noes. And if you would like to vote in abstention, please walk through the centre door. Thank you very much.